Welcome to FO Talks again. With me is Gary Grappo, our former chair, a noted American diplomat, scholar, and now professor teaching Middle East studies. Gary, this is part three of your FO Talks. You will be speaking on America's new, fast changing role in the Middle East. So here we are. We've covered a lot of ground in parts one and two. Those of you who have not heard it and are listening to this should go and listen to parts one and two, uh, perhaps chronologically. So, Gary, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Atul. It's always a pleasure to be with you and to discuss, as you very accurately state, a very fast changing role for the United States in the Middle East, and one that looks a little, at least at the present time, certainly probably to many outside observers, to be a bit uncertain, not only because of events in the Middle East and the changing complexity of arrangements and relationships in that part of the world, but also internal political events here in the United States.
Yes, exactly. So, we now have war between Israel and Hezbollah, which is going on in Lebanon. The Israel and Hamas uh, has been going on for a year. Uh, a certain gentleman, you can tell us more about him, the mastermind of those attacks, has been killed. Apparently, it was not quite a planned assassination. Uh, so, lots going on. And indeed, today I read in numerous American publications that there is nervousness in both camps as to how strong their support is amongst the Jewish and the Arab American communities. So there is a conflict abroad, and that conflict has no longer just stayed abroad, it has come inside to the US too.
Without question, it has. First, to the question of the killing of Yahya Sinwar.
Mhm.
As one former military officer once shared with me, and also a combat veteran, I'd rather be lucky than good any day. And in this particular case, the Israelis happen to be both lucky and good. The circumstances surrounding the opportunity to remove him were long in train on the part of the Israelis through intelligence and military operations, and it was really only a matter of time before they finally found him. In this particular case, it was by pure chance. A group of a very small group of infantry soldiers happened to identify some movement in a building, and it turned out that one of the three people identified turned out to be Sinwar, who was taken out in a apparently single tank artillery fire. So this will deal, or has dealt, a devastating blow to Hamas. I would argue more on the morale front than the political front. It appears, in fact, it's just been recently reported that Hamas, for the time being, will refrain from naming a particular successor and will turn to a group of four senior Hamas officials to lead the organization. And that may simply be to avoid putting a target on someone else. Although, in truth, it probably means if this report is correct, that there'll be four targets out there. Although I'm sure many of these were already targets for the Israelis to begin with. This is the Israeli MO. It has been that way for decades, to attack the leadership of its enemies, and it's often been very successful in actually taking out these leaderships.
Sheikh
It is quite
Yassin, the
Sheikh
founder of Hamas
Yassin.
himself, a
Yes,
blind sheikh in a
there you
wheelchair.
go. Yes, and But there's real question and debate, and that includes here in this country, because the United States has often employed the same tactic. To what effect in terms of the function of the particular enemy organization? Hamas is still going to continue, probably not as effectively as before, but that was also a result of the devastating losses that they suffered over the course of the almost 13 months of war against the IDF. So the combination of that plus the losing of Sinwar, I think, is a major morale blow. Most, well, the Israelis have even come out and said that Hamas has been reduced to gangs of guerrilla fighters throughout the Gaza Strip. So they lack probably the overarching coordinating function that may have existed certainly when the war started, but even continuing on through the middle point of the war. Now, roving gangs, armed, are still a threat, not only to anyone inside Gaza, but certainly to Israelis outside Gaza. So this is still a continuing problem for Israel and will remain so. But I think it's far less of a threat to Israel than it was 1 year ago, and of course is nowhere near the kind of threat that Israel faces with Hamas, or with Hezbollah. I'm sorry.
Hezbollah. Yeah. So let's break it down. I've been reading a lot of scenarios from various people and from various countries. So one scenario is that, well, Sinwar is dead, so now you can have peace. He was the person who was the hardline fanatic. Now you could have pragmatists, not exactly peace, but some kind of ceasefire. And after this, the people of Gaza may overthrow Hamas because they've been chafing under Hamas. Hamas may also disintegrate because now the leadership is gone, and there might be a number of ambitious young men rising up the ranks, young leaders who may not take authority from each other. So there are many, many such scenarios floating around, and of course these are very optimistic. And needless to say, the Israelis tend to go by these scenarios. They tend to favor these scenarios. At the same time, there are people like our mutual friend who retired from the CIA who says that you can never destroy an idea. And sometimes, if an organization disintegrates, the rogue elements can be even more vicious, and something worse can take its place, such as Hezbollah replacing Palestinian Liberation Organization after 1982. Where do you stand in terms of looking forward, in terms of scenarios? Because you've served in the region. Indeed, you retired, I believe, from Jerusalem. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts.
At the present, Atul, I don't see an end of the fighting in Gaza, and I base this on the nature of Hamas itself, and also on some of the comments that we've heard from Israeli authorities, including Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. I don't think the Israelis yet consider this a job done, and that they need to continue the fight to further diminish the fighting power of Hamas and go after some of these remaining leaders who, certainly not of the stature of Sinwar, can nevertheless more or less say allow the organization to hobble forward. They will certainly receive some kind of assistance from the outside. It's not clear yet. I don't have a great deal of insight into that. But that has probably doubtlessly been constrained as well, given the circumstances and the vice-like grip that the Israelis now have on Gaza. So in case of the Israel-Hamas confrontation, while it certainly could possibly end up in a ceasefire situation, I don't see I don't see either of the two sides moving that way. But I still hold out some possibility of that. And of course, we have the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in the region now, I think today in Israel, to advance that very thing. And we'll have to see.
He's emulating Henry Kissinger's diplomacy.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's his 11th trip to the Middle East since the start of the war. So hats off for effort to Mr. Blinken. On the Hezbollah side, the Israelis clearly are not done, even though they have destroyed enormous amounts of assets. They've taken out Nasrallah. They took out his successor, and maybe the successor of the successor. Again, this is playing off the same play sheet for the Israelis, going after the leadership, trying to decapitate the leadership, which in the case of Hezbollah is more numerous and more widespread. And so that will take substantially more effort, but one has to be impressed with the success they've had to this point. Moreover,
they also took out Hezbollah's military leadership, the Radwan force. They called a meeting and killed all the senior officers who went to that meeting.
Yes, I mean, one of the amazing results of the exploding pager episode is that it has destroyed all confidence of Hezbollah in their electronic communication systems. And so they've had to resort to in-person meetings, and the Israelis, with their exceptional intelligence, have been able to identify some of those and therefore are able to take out a number of leaders in a single attack. And it's having an effect on Hezbollah's political leadership as well as its military leadership. And in any conflict, that's the kind of impact you want to have. And then thirdly, I will say that they're also taking out a lot of their ballistic missiles, drones, and other ammunition. They've discovered a number of weapons depots buried underground, similar to what Hamas has done. So they've made substantial progress. But if you look at the ground game, that is the advance of Israeli troops on the ground in southern Lebanon, I think they're being very prudent in moving slowly, not advancing quickly, because they don't want to experience the problem they had in Gaza early in the war, where they would clear out a particular area and move on to another area, only to find that Gaza or Hamas fighters in Gaza would come up behind them through the tunnels. So in this case, I think the Israelis are being a bit more methodical and deliberate and patient about the land game in southern Lebanon. But unlike Gaza, there is a limit to how far they will advance. We don't know what that is at the moment. All they have said is their objective is to ensure the safety and security of Israelis they wish to see return to their residences in northern Israel. What that entails in terms of clearing in southern Lebanon is not yet known. Under UN Security Council Resolution 1701, passed at the end of the last Hezbollah-Israel conflict in 2006, Hezbollah was supposed to have withdrawn to the Litani River, which is about 25 to 30 kilometers north of the Blue Line, which is the more or less the border between Israel and Lebanon.
So much so for a picture of what is going on. But there has been an intelligence leak from the US about US information about Israeli plans to strike Iran and to strike their nuclear sites, their military installations, and of course their their oil depots and oil ports. So, question here is Israel planning to do so, and if so, what is the role in the U.S. in all this conflict? The U.S. says it is playing a restraining role, and its critics say that the U.S. is abetting Israeli adventurism and ironically, a Democrat government is supporting a far-right coalition, and it shows that it doesn't matter who's in charge in Washington. Washington is beholden to Jerusalem.
Well, I will qualify what I'm about to say with this statement, and that is we are in the midst of a highly contentious political election here in this country.
Mm.
And while foreign policy issues don't typically rise to the attention of American voters as they go to the polls, it is this time. And it's not just this issue. I think the Ukraine-Russia issue is very much on the minds of at least some voters, not an insignificant number, and even questions of the challenges we face from China. And so politicians of the left or the right are going to have to be guarded in what they say. And that is clearly the case in this election, even more so because one of the candidates, Vice President Harris, is part of the sitting administration. And so she cannot appear to criticize, certainly directly, the current administration's policy. She's tried to hedge herself about as far as one can go, while not running amok of the current of the policy of the current administration. So she's somewhat constrained. Her opponent has a bit more freedom, and all he has been saying, Mr. Trump, is this would not have happened under his watch, which of course is nonsense. Hamas doesn't take into calculation who the American president is when they decide to carry out a terrorist attack.
Isn't Hamas terrified of Donald Trump, and they wouldn't have dared to do this had he been president?
Nonsense. The only thing that can be said about Mr. Trump is he's extraordinarily unpredictable. He demonstrated that when he was president before Mr. Biden, and listening to his campaign rhetoric, I would conclude the same thing. And it's pretty hard to draw any conclusions about what his foreign policy would be, whether on this particular issue or on any other.
Understood. Both candidates are playing politics with the current situation. That that is an aside. A bigger question, the deeper question is, what is the U.S. role here, given this triangle of, or actually maybe a quadrangle of Hamas, Hezbollah, of course the Houthis, and Iran?
Well, I think you just gave the answer, and that is Israel is under attack on multiple fronts. The United States historically has been Israel's strongest ally, and under any U.S. president, any U.S. administration, going back to Harry Truman, we have seen a steadfast support for the state of Israel, most especially when it faces a direct challenge from one of its neighbors. Now, today, the challenges don't come from other Arab countries, as they had in the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe even the 80s.
We've covered that in previous videos, and even Syria, which is the most hostile state, because of course the Egyptians have a peace treaty with Israel. They've had it since 1973. Jordan has made its peace. Lebanon has been a dysfunctional state and is not in a condition, not in a situation to invade. So Syria, which is the most hostile state, even Syria has been prudent. So they don't really face any threats on their borders from a state actor.
No, no. The only state actor from which they face a threat, of course, is Iran, which is not on Israel's border, but nevertheless poses a very significant threat. And so, that's where the attention among Americans and probably American politicians is that we have to remain steadfast in our support, given the existential threat that Israel faces from a more distant adversary, namely Iran. But several things here. Because the United States is this steadfast ally and supporter of Israel, doesn't exclude the United States from exerting its best efforts to restore peace and stability to the region. It has been one of its driving objectives, most definitely since the '67 war, and that is to bring peace and stability. And our successes have been fitful. The most significant, of course, was the Camp David Accords and the subsequent peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. We've had other achievements, and by the way, I say we collectively working with a number of moderate Arab states, Jordan, as you mentioned, and then more recently under the Abraham Accords, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and subsequently Sudan. So, yeah, the threat that Israel faces today is not from its Arab neighbors, Syria being, as you accurately indicated, in somewhat of a special category. It's Iran, and more particularly Iranian-inspired revolutionary or militia groups, whether it's the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and a number of others based out of either Syria or Iraq. Those groups function as mercenaries for Iran. They are comprised entirely of Arabs. Arabs have been brought on by the Islamic State of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, as mercenaries for Persia. We have to stop and reflect on what that means. Why are Arabs fighting on behalf of the Persians?
They're a historical
Yeah,
enemy, and
they're
it's important to remember, and for our viewers to remember, especially if they are younger and they are in US or Europe even, is that Shias comprise about 10% roughly. You can correct me, Gary, if I've got the figures wrong. And Sunnis are 90%. And Iran is a revolutionary power since 1979. It's a Shia power. And there is an element of both racial and religious um, divide um, between Iran and the Arab world. So it is quite extraordinary that Iran has been able to rally a Sunni Arab force called Hamas uh,
well, we have to
to
qualify
as an
that.
ally. Yeah.
Hezbollah is
Shia,
Arab,
Hezbollah and
is
Houthis are Shia.
is Shia.
Yeah.
The Houthis as well, although a
Yeah.
different sect of Shia
Zaydis.
Islam.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the only real tie is that religious connection. And the one with the Houthis is far more recent than the one with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which goes back to the early 16th century. So, but the point that Arabs would sign on to fight as mercenaries on behalf of Persia, of Iran, remains something of a conundrum, at least to me, and why they would
Mhm.
do such a thing.
I mean, people say that Iran is the only power supporting them. The Arab leaders, and I hear this again and again from many dissident young Arabs, is that Arab leaders have turned into Judases living in their palaces. So, you've heard it. You're smiling. I'm sure you've heard it 100 more times than me.
there's absolutely no love lost, none whatsoever, between the Arab states and Hamas, Hezbollah, or the
Yeah.
Houthis. None whatsoever. And I would probably throw in the assorted militias in Syria and Iraq as well. And so now, what complicates what the Arab governments can do in a situation like this, because on the surface they would appear to be natural allies of Israel, which they are. Uh, but it's the complication of the Palestinians and the fact that Israel is not willing, at least in the person of Mr. Netanyahu, is not willing even to acknowledge the vision of a Palestinian state somewhere out, even in the distant future. And that weighs heavily on the minds of Arabs throughout the Middle East. And for that reason, Arab governments, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Morocco, whether it's Egypt, have to hedge their comments and their actions in support of Israel. And it's unfortunate that Mr. Netanyahu has adopted this policy. However, given the current thinking of his countrymen, I can understand. There is very little sentiment today in Israel for a Palestinian state, not after what they have suffered on October 7th and what has occurred subsequently. And similarly, on the Palestinian side, there is no hope, no anticipation of their own independent state. And so we find an uncommon number of Palestinians, fewer in Gaza, I will say, based on what I have heard and seen and read, than in the West Bank. But we've seen this uncommon and counterproductive sympathy for Hamas among the Palestinians, again driven by the war. And so this is where the United States comes in. I believe to yeah.
Can I very quickly clarify a point, or rather, make a point that many of our authors make. They point out that Israel has had its cake and eaten it too. They say Israel has managed to get peace, whatever it wanted, from all the Arab states, whilst not making concessions. In fact, it has violated international law and the requests, repeated requests of US administrations and continued settlements. They've continued settlements in the West Bank. They have continued. Yes, of course, they've pulled out settlements from Gaza, but they have continued to push out the Palestinian, squeeze out the Palestinian leadership. In fact, in the early days, they even backed Hamas to weaken the Palestinian Liberation Organization or the Palestinian Authority. So what people say is, yes, the Israelis suffered enormously on October 7th, but they have not been serious about peace. In particular, one leader, and you know Benjamin Netanyahu, you know him, you've studied him for many years. He has been Pied Piper of a very dangerous tune. And some argue it is his dangerous tune that led to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who signed the Oslo Accords. So I'll stop now. But that is the yes, the Israeli side is, yes, they've suffered violence and intifada and terrorist attacks. But then the other side is they've suffered discrimination. They've suffered, that's the argument, they've suffered illegal settlements. And now we are in a state of impasse.
We most definitely are in a state of impasse. And it's one of those things that the United States has been working heretofore fruitlessly, at least under the Biden administration, to change. We, at a period just before the Camp David II discussions in the summer of 2000, the attitude toward peace with the Palestinians among Israelis was quite favorable. The Second Intifada, as we discussed in one of our previous episodes, really changed that considerably. It really flipped the needle and allowed Mr. Netanyahu to capitalize on the prevailing sentiment then against a Palestinian state to advance his own agenda, which was to never recognize a Palestinian state. Bibi Netanyahu has objected to it systematically and consistently throughout his political life. And he's only dug in deeper, excuse me, since I'd say the mid 2000s, and and uh, and so this what had been conflicting tensions, political tensions within Israel regarding the Palestinian state have now merged and have now become intertwined to the point that there is no Israeli left. Excuse me. There is very little movement on the part of the Israeli body politic to move toward a negotiated Palestinian state, without reference to time frame and the conditions for that, simply because current and certainly in this state of war, they don't see a possibility, full stop, and the Palestinians don't either. And so, as I was about to say earlier, what is the role of the United States in this conflict, aside from our support from Israel, which we discussed, and that is to try and provide some sense of hope to Palestinians that something can be done, and a way to wait out Mr. Netanyahu. And now that may take a while because Mr. Netanyahu, you've heard me say it many, many times before, he has more lives than a cat. He managed to survive crisis after crisis in his several governments and emerges maybe not totally unscathed, but he remains in office. He's almost the Berlusconi of Israel, and
without the many girlfriends.
Without the girlfriends. Yeah, he does not have that.
To be fair to him, he's a family man, and he's such a family man that allegedly he earns a lot of money, hush hush off the record on the QT, so that multiple generations of his clan can live in splendor.
Perhaps I lack information to offer comment.
That's why I said allegedly.
Allegedly, okay.
I mean, he is accused of corruption, and
yes, he
part
is.
of the fear many Israelis have about his conduct of the war is it is in his interest to stretch it like a piece of string, because
Yes.
the longer the war goes on, the less likely he'll be tried, and others may die, but he'll be safe.
And moreover, he's kind of riding a wave right now of tactical successes with respect to the war in Gaza as well as in southern Lebanon. And so that is certainly not hurting his political fortunes either, although I think polls still generally indicate that Israelis would prefer him to go.
So here's a question. So the US strategy is wait Netanyahu out. Let's say he goes tomorrow. Are there leaders who'd be more favorable to peace? Because the attack, October 7th attack, actually, was on a lot of left-leaning communes. And the left, which has long held the torch of peace, is also worried about Palestinian state, particularly Palestinian state which can use force against Israel.
I think it's going to take a Nixon to China sort of figure in Israel to advance the two-state solution, and it won't. That person will not come from the Israeli left. I'm not even aware of anyone on the left in Israel who has the possibility of advancing such a notion, but someone on the right who sees the inevitability of a two-state solution can start the process. Now, having said that, we have to look at the other side of the equation, the Palestinians, who at the present moment not only lack leadership, but they also lack organization. And so they are not in a position to govern anything, much less sit down at the table with the Israelis and negotiate anything close to a two-state solution at the present time and for the foreseeable future, I will say. And that not only has to do, as I said, with the absence of leadership and organization, but attitudes among Palestinians in general, that this kind of a conversation simply cannot take place. But, you know, I tell my students, talking to the Palestinians about peace and a two-state solution is like asking a drowning man what dessert he would like for lunch. This is just not something that really is approachable for the Palestinians, nor for that matter the Israelis at the present time.
So, a question for you, follow-up question. Given the conflict, given the fact that Hamas has been hit hard, given the fact that there will be chaos, how will interlocutors appear among the Palestinians? And another important, who will appear as an interlocutor on the Shia side in Lebanon? So we are in a huge quandary now, and this could be like a frozen conflict that carries on for many, many, many years. And within Israel itself, the left, the secular Jews, are having less children, the more religious are having more children, and the polity is skewing right.
This is really a very disturbing element, and I think I've alluded to it, but you have really hit it on the spot, and that is that there is no other side yet to the Palestinians or to the Shia of Lebanon or to the Iranians at the moment. What we are confronted with is a very hard right militaristic leaderships in all three of these entities, two organizations and one state, which makes it very, very hard to negotiate, despite the best efforts of the current administration. The advantage we have in Lebanon is that we have a Lebanese government, and the Lebanese government at some point might be able to exert some influence. The Lebanese government does present an alternative in Lebanon. The problem, of course, we have in Lebanon is an extraordinarily weak government. And so it's highly questionable how much influence they will be able to have.
I would even go deeper. Is Lebanon an effective state? Because it's so fragmented. It's such a mosaic of different communities pulling in different directions, and non-state actors fill the void the state fails to. So can Lebanon even succeed as a state? Or again, are we talking about a frozen internal battle over control of the state?
With a much weakened Hezbollah, there is the possibility, I would say, but this is not going to. It's not a situation that's going to turn around in a few days, weeks, months. This situation is a result of accumulated events and activities and maneuverings, most especially on the part of Hezbollah and a compromised elite in Lebanon, and has brought Lebanon to this point where it's effectively politically and economically on its knees. So that's the situation that the U.S. confronts in trying to resolve these various conflicts. And I will make one more point before we close, and I think this will be important for FO listeners, and that is the following: in a negotiation, a mediator, such as the role the United States is trying to play in all of this, is to focus on the core interest of the various parties and to find a way to work around the core interests so that somehow they may be satisfied. And in the case of Israel, and that is the most relevant because the U.S. administration takes a considerable amount of criticism for its inability to persuade the Israeli government to do one thing or another. The Israelis, and certainly in the person of Netanyahu, see their current conflicts with Hamas, with Hezbollah, and with Iran, I would include the Houthis too, as existential. You can't compromise on those. No country would compromise on its national security interests. And so trying to persuade Mr. Netanyahu or the Israeli leadership to somehow accept less than what they feel is necessary for the security of the Israeli state is an almost impossible task.
You can have a maximalist view of national security in which you say, okay, we have to kill every last man standing, or you can have a more long-term strategic view of national security in which you say, okay, well, we've tried ABC, it has worked so far, and now we'll try XYZ. And national security is defined expansively and also pragmatically, depending on who the leader is. After all, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin were able to conclude a peace deal. But that is not the case, for instance, with the al-Assad family and Israel. So, yeah, these
No, I mean,
definitions are tricky.
they are, and in the case of Begin Sadat, you had two leaders who were genuinely interested in and committed to finding peace. We don't have that with respect to Israel Iran, Israel Hamas, or Israel Hezbollah. Could it be that Israel could find some kind of accommodation with more far-sighted leaders in those organizations and country? It's almost impossible to conceive of leaders of that nature in those organizations, considering and country, considering their overarching ideologies, which start with the elimination of the state of Israel. I mean, there's no compromise there. There's no room for discussion. And so that presents a real challenge for a mediator. But is there this magical sweet spot that you're referring to on the spectrum? And that's what Mr. Blinken, Mr. Hochstein, and ultimately Joe Biden are attempting to find. And that may require time.
I mean, so we are in this crazy vortex that Iran has a hardline regime, and the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah are doctrinaire militant organizations, and they feed the far right. Certain cabinet ministers in Israel are not exactly lovey-dovey characters, and that far right instead fills these characters, and so we almost seem to be in this vicious spiral, in this whirlpool that is in everything.
We are indeed, and I think that's why Israel is pursuing the policies and the military strategies we are observing. That is, to so severely weaken Hamas and Hezbollah that they no longer present this threat to Israel that they have in the past. That changes the dynamic, the paradigm, and also now presents a genuine threat to Iran. It really now Israel has not responded yet to the October 1st attacks of Iran against Israel, which were hardly effective at all. And so Iran is having to contend with a potential conflict with with one of the two powers it wanted to avoid having a conflict with, Israel. Because you get one, you get the other. You get Israel, you potentially get the United States, and that's just something Iran can't deal with. So by weakening Hamas and Hezbollah, it forces the Iranian leadership to rethink their strategy with regard to their axis of resistance, this ring of fire, all the other terms that they use, and take a less aggressive stance with respect to Israel, which is all Israel is asking. They don't want to be friends with Israel? Fine. But don't threaten us. And I think Israel would be happy with that.
Well, we'll see. I think Israel's polity will also have to change, and you
Oh, most
cannot have,
definitely.
yeah, you cannot have some of the crazies talking some of the hardline stuff that they are and expect peace. On that note, thank you very much. We'll continue this discussion. Gary Grapple will be back, and it is bye for now.
Thank you very much, Katul.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.